as you are writing your poems, one of the things that I think you really need to consider is how is everything reinforcing what the poem's trying to do in terms of the word choice, the speaker and the characters in the poem, the tone of the language that you're using, the very structure of the piece as well. And in fact, we're going to be targeting that last area to see how it can reinforce some of the actions, the sequences, and also the meanings that a poem has. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, guys. Welcome to Fine Print. This is your weekly poetry analysis show where we take a look at a poem that you wrote and sent to us to analyze. And we're not here to critique, we're not here to say some things that are working wrong or some things that are working well. We're just here to see what is actually happening in the poem itself. And to guide you in this journey, there is me. Hello, guys. My name is Jeff. It rhymes with breath. We have a poem today that was sent to us very kindly by, I have to find it. I'm going to load it up manually. Give it 1 second. We'll take a look at what our piece is for today. There we are. This poem was sent to us by The Light Mapper. We want to give them a quick thank you for allowing us to dive into their work. We're going to take a look at this piece and then talk about some thoughts and things. And of course, if you want to share your own thoughts, because everything here is just my own perspective, we would love to have your own insights too about what you see happening in the piece. Feel free to put them in the chat if you're live with us or in the comments if you're watching on the replay. What's up to David hanging with us? This poem doesn't have a title. In the heat of the night at the sweltering shore, can you feel the cool breeze grace your beautiful face? How I long to be walking along, dodging seashells by moonlight. And again, thank you to the Light Mapper for sending us this poem. And when I was looking at this piece, one of the things that I was really thinking about, and I think that you can see even if you just look at it visually, is it takes on the form of another type of poetry, or another type of poem called a tanka, which is related to a haiku, which you can find, might be easier if I just share my entire screen. So if you haven't heard of that form, what does this look like? And here are some guidelines. This is from Poetry Pop Poetry Blog. Okay. Whoa, sorry for freaking you out there. And they talk about just some basic tips you want to consider for a tanka. 5 lines, untitled, punctuation generally not used, unrhymed syllable count 5, 7, 5, 7, 7, so similar to a haiku, then adding 2 lines of 7. We'll talk about that in a moment though. A single unbroken sentence. Okay. There's a turn that happens halfway through. It begins by addressing an observation, okay, typically from the point of view of the poet. Okay. Lines in general don't begin with articles. You want to end the poem with a statement, and then they mention some editing. They give a quick example here. This is from Tada Chimako. The hot water in the abandoned kettle slowly cools, still carrying the resentment of cold water. Okay, so that is just an example. One of the things that I think we really need to consider when we're talking about these sorts of poems is I think a lot of times, just based on the education that people have, people get really obsessed with syllable counts. But we have to remember that these are coming from Japanese, and Japanese operates less on syllables and operates more on mora, which are shorter than syllables are. So when you hear people say, a haiku is 575, I think we have to remember that that is an attempt at a translation of the form into English, but Japanese, among other structures, is operating on a completely different format. So I would personally advocate less for sticking with the syllable counts and more with the idea of brevity and things like that. Just a little note. Why are we even mentioning any of that? So let's look at our original poem. I always get very interested when poems take on forms that are similar to other forms, but not completely. Okay, so for instance, tanka is typically being a little bit shorter than this in terms of line length. But there's a lot of other similar, the lack of punctuation and things like that. the taking on the perspective of the speaker, although they are addressing the you, um, and things like that. Like there's a lot of similarities with tankas, but not quite. So when that happens, when we have a poem that is similar but not quite, the question I always ask myself is it purely coincidence? Is it intentional? If it is intentional, why are we making that choice? Um, and if it's not intentional, then we find out about the form. Is it something that maybe is worth exploring? It's like the case where like you read a poem that's like 13 lines, and it's like, you're 13 lines. Why are we purposely not doing a sonnet? You know, because we're already there. It, almost, just tweaking your meter and your rhyme. So that's kind of my initial question is, what is the meaning I can take away from this poem that is so close to being a tanka but not quite a tanka? That's kind of the first thing. But in addition to that, let's just kind of look at some stress patterns here. So in the heat, so in that case we have what's called anapest. It's like in the heat of the night. Okay, so stress on heat, stress on night. At the swell, turning shore. Another anapest. So lots of anapests. So look at the rhythm that we kind of get here. It's this kind of meandering in the heat of the night, at the sweltering shore. It's like that sort of kind of lull into the poem, I think, is interesting. Followed by, can you feel the cool breeze? So again, we're back in the more anapests. Things change. Like, can you feel the cool breeze? Grace your beautiful face. So now what we get trochees, and then we get this like beautiful anapest face stress. How I long, now we're back to anapest, to be walking with the feminine, the weak stress at the end. Um, then we get dodging seashells by moonlight. Okay. All right. So I thought, in terms of the meter of the poem, I also thought this was very interesting. And this, I think, kind of harkens back to the idea of your turn occurring. Where's your turn occurring? I would make the argument that your turn. Two places where I could see arguments for the turn. I could see it here with the shift to the addressing the you, or the how. Okay. The turn is somewhere around here, which again speaks to tankas and what tankas are trying to do. Okay. Um, maybe the turn is actually more on that grace line, just because of the shift in the meter. Okay. That's the first indication, and that would be right kind of smack in the middle, which in general I feel like turns again tend to come later, but in a short form like this, I think you have a little bit more flexibility. Um, so some things that I think the meter is doing that really kind of reinforce some things. So let's just kind of talk about what's happening in the poem. So in the heat of the night at the sweltering shore, so we have this sense of overwhelm and oppressive heat, high temperatures. Doesn't feel particularly comfortable, right? In the heat of the night at the sweltering shore. Okay, so there's a lot of these unpleasant aspects happening, right? But after all of this negativity, what do we get? Can you feel the cool breeze? So then there's this moment of relief, right? Grace your beautiful face. It's interesting because we don't entirely know the speaker's experience there. We only know. We can imagine if the speaker is mentioning these things that the speaker is aware of them, but we're not entirely sure of that. We actually don't even know if the speaker is there. There's almost like this idea of, I think, separation between speaker and you. like the speaker, especially you can see it like in the last two lines, how I long to be walking along. Like it's almost like the speaker wants to be where the you is potentially. There is this kind of sense of separation I think that's coming through. Um, and so it's almost like the speaker's kind of just imagining what the other person might be feeling. Um, I think that the grace your beautiful face. This is different because suddenly the poem to this point has been very concrete in the description, like in the heat of night, very heavy on the sensory. At the sweltering shore, can you feel the cool breeze? We're really grounded in very concrete image. And then the grace your beautiful face. This is the moment where suddenly things dive into abstraction. I like the use of grace as a verb. Um, like you have an idea of kind of like a concrete meaning. Like you can imagine like the breeze kind of touching the you's face. But at the same time, it's also at this abstract level. Um, so that line, that grace is kind of flirting between concrete versus the abstraction and the emotion. And that is also what the rest of the poem kind of continues in that moment, which can again suggest that maybe the turn is really on that grace line. And I think that the fact that that grace starts with the heavy stress, this is the first time we get the trochee, right? We get the heavy stress followed by the weak, the gracier. So we start with that trochee, which is very punchy, starting a line with the stress, whereas everything else before this has been reduced and weak, with the anapest. So to shift over to the trochees to signal that we're switching over to the abstraction and to the mind and the imagination. I think that that is doing a lot of work, which I like. Um, and then we get the bounce back to what happened previously. We're back to the anapest, right? Like how I long to be walking, but now it's different, right? Along. How I long to be walking along. So we have a shift from what we had previously, which again, I like that break. I like that it's telling us we're almost like where we were before. We're similar to what we were doing before, but it's also different now. We're adding a little bit with that along. We're adding that extra straight. How to be walking along. How I long to be walking along. So we're similar to what happened before, but now we're also different. And I think that that line, structurally with the meter, is again doing a lot of work. It's saying, hey, we're similar to the first moment in the beginning of the poem, but we're also in a new territory too with the longing. And then with how do we end? Dodging seashells by moonlight. The really punchy trochees again. Dodging seashells by moonlight. Um, and I think that kind of also reinforces that sense of like dodge. Like you feel like you have to move quick, like dodging seashells by moonlight. Like the movement suddenly speeds up a lot, which again I think kind of reinforces that dodging. And what I like about that last line too is again a concrete image, but we're still in the imagination because we're still in the longing of the line before. How I long to be walking along. I'm not there. I long to be there. Um, so I like the shifts that are happening right around um, the grace line down. Like the poem starts very concrete. We think we're in one moment, and then it turns out that no, we're actually in the imagination, in the mind of the speaker. So I think that transition from concrete moment to actual kind of mental imagination, I think that transition is doing a lot of work, um, enhanced by how the change in the meter occurs. Okay, so what does that have to do with us? Well, that means that hey, in your own poems, how are you using your form to kind of reinforce those shifts that maybe occur? Maybe how are you using your form in terms of your meter to reinforce where your volta is? How are you using your turn to how are you reinforcing your form to complement the tension of the piece? All these little things. How can every choice that you make inside of your poem reinforce the direction that the poem wants to go in? I think this is the challenge that um, is really exemplified by this piece and something that we want to continue doing in our own work, I think. So thank you once more to the Light Mapper for allowing us to dive into your piece. If you guys have other thoughts on anything that we discussed, be sure to let me know. Otherwise, we'll be back with more fine print on next Sunday. I hope you guys have a good day, have a good night, and a good